Okay, here we have the second video on consumer surplus. I just wanted to go over a few extra points. First of all, this series of videos is specific really for OCR A-level economics, and what I've put on here is some of the past questions that relate to consumer surplus. We can see here, for instance, F581, these are new style of papers. 609 means June 2009, question 3A and B. So for instance, 603 CI and CII means June 2003, question CI and CII. This is really useful for you when you're revising, and I do recommend that you use numerous past papers to help with your revision. Okay, going to consumer surplus then. Here's a diagram. But before we do that, let's just recap on the definition. It's the difference between what a consumer is willing to pay for a good, as shown by the demand curve, and what they actually pay for the good, as shown by the equilibrium price. In this case, it's P1. So quite simply, what is the area of consumer surplus on this diagram? Well, it's exactly what we're saying in the definition. It's the difference between the price that's being charged in the market, P1, and the price they'd be willing to pay. So it's basically this entire area here, or P1, A, B. And we can see this quite simply, can't we? Because a lot of consumers are willing to pay a higher price than they're currently being charged. Let's have a look at this. So for instance, a small number of consumers, if we go up there, would have actually been willing to pay this price. They're obviously getting the good at a cheaper price than they've been willing to pay for. For a number of consumers, they'd have been willing to pay this price, and so forth. So it's the difference between what consumer is willing to pay, as shown by the demand curve, and what they actually show, shown by the equilibrium price. That's P1AB. Now don't forget, the most common way you're going to get asked about that in OCR is a 2-mark question. So remember, if it's going to be 2 marks, nice concise definition. Right, if we have a look then at a question like this, you may be asked just to purely show consumer surplus. That's unlikely. The main way that they ask about this question is showing what will happen if there's an increase or decrease in price in the market. Let's have a look at this scenario. Imagine you get a question that says, explain what happens if there's a reduction in price in the market. Explain what happens to consumer surplus. Let's have a look at this on the diagram now. First of all, we just illustrate the new price. We'll call it P2. And a new quantity, we'll call it Q2. Well, it's quite simple really. What has happened is that consumer surplus has increased. And that'd be one of the first things that I put in my answer. Consumer surplus has increased. We could actually show this and label this, for instance, C. So consumer surplus has increased. Initial consumer surplus, so initial consumer surplus was the area P1, A, B. New consumer surplus is P2, A, C. And the addition, therefore, to consumer surplus was this area here. And that is P1, B, C, P2. So it's kind of important that we go through 4 points really. First of all, what has happened to consumer surplus? In this case, consumer surplus has increased. What was the initial consumer surplus? We can see that here, P1, A, B. What is the new consumer surplus? Well, that's P2, A, C, and what has actually been the change in the consumer surplus, i.e. what's additional? And we can see this by the shaded area here, which is P2, P1, B, C. So we've actually got 4 distinct points, and that will help you in OCR get all the marks on this type of question. Now alternatively, you may get a question which says what happens if price increases in a market. Well, it's really quite simple. Imagine we were initially at price P1. If the price rose, for instance, to P3, the new consumer area of consumer surplus is obviously this new shaded area here, P3A, let's call it D. So basically it's the reverse of what's happened if there's a decrease in price. I hope that's helpful.